EV FUD, that's fear, uncertainty and doubt, is everywhere. It's on your TV. It's here on YouTube. It's in our social media. And for those who prefer their media be printed on dead trees and delivered to their door every morning, or perhaps grabbed from a pile of newspapers at the train station every day only to be left and forgotten for someone else to pick up upon arrival, it's in our newspapers. We have made plenty of videos debunking EV FUD on this channel, covering everything from claims that battery packs won't last more than a few years and cost more than half an average person's annual salary to replace, through to some of the more esoteric ones, like the claim that EVs can't charge in the rain or will give you cancer. But despite the best attempts of the world's spin doctors and story after breathless story claiming EVs will bring the modern world to its knees, EV sales continue to rise. Granted, EV sales in some countries aren't as good as they are in others, but whichever way you look at it, people keep buying EVs, and that's fantastic news. But a new Gallup poll has just been published that suggests there's some bad news to go with the increased number of EVs on the road. What is it, I hear you ask? That EVs are still not as affordable as we'd like them to be? No, although they're not. Is it perhaps that EV charging is still incredibly unreliable and we're still not seeing public charging deployed at a speed that matches the rate of EV adoption? While this is an issue, and we've covered that plenty before, for the benefit of this video, the answer is no. No, this particular bad news is about the drop in the number of people who are expressing an interest in buying their first EV. And that's led some people to suggest that the EV market is reaching a saturation point. So, is it true? Is EV FUD working? Or is there something else at play? Let's find out. For a while now, well-known global research and consulting firm Gallup, which is known for its many surveys on everything from political races through to how much sleep people are getting, has been polling people on their thoughts towards electric vehicles. Its most recent survey on EV ownership, though, shows a troubling trend, namely an increase in the number of people who say they will not be buying an electric vehicle in the future, up from 41% of respondents in 2023 to 48% this year. At the same time, it recorded an identical drop in the number of people who say they would consider an EV at some point in the future, down from 43% in 2023 to 35% this year. Interestingly, this means those two groups of respondents accounted for 84% of the same sample group in both years, and suggests that there's a bit of an education barrier surrounding EVs and the general public. This is backed up by the fact that while the number of people who said they now own an electric vehicle has grown by 3%, up to 7% of respondents this year, the number of people who said they would seriously consider buying an EV dropped by the same percentage. That group, 16% of respondents in both years, suggests that in order for EVs to truly increase in market share, we need to see some serious changes in the way that EVs are marketed and sold in the US. Combine this with sales data from around the world that shows EV adoption rates in the US are quickly falling behind other nations, and we have a big problem. So today, I'm going to go into this survey in more detail and examine what's going on with the US market and attitudes towards EVs. I'm going to dig deeper to explain some of the socio-economic barriers that exist and ask if political leaning and FUD is more than partly to blame for where we find ourselves today. The short answer to that is yes. The long answer is hell yes. And the full answer? Let's get into it. And yes, there's going to be some political stuff in here, as I just hinted, because this survey does have some pretty strong apparent political influences. First, the basics. Gallup, unlike many pollsters, is really good at telling you the full details of its survey, and being able to understand this really does help cement the data's reliability, which Gallup says has a margin of sampling error plus or minus 4% at a confidence level of 95%. In this case, it states it sampled 1,016 adults aged 18 and older spread across 50 US states and the District of Columbia. The interviews took place over the telephone, with 80% of respondents taking the call on their cell phone and 20% taking place on landlines. Interviews were conducted in both Spanish and English, as preferred by the interviewee, and Gallup says it weighted the samples to correct for unequal selection probability, non-response, and double coverage of the same person through cell phone and landline. Sampling was also weighted to match the national demographics in the US of gender, age, race, ethnicity, education, region, population, and phone status, and based that weighting on the most recent US census from 2020. I am going to link to the data in the down below, so those of you who are maths nerds can get all up in the data in ways that I know I can't. And boy, does that data show us some interesting things. For example, while I've already given you the headline data, if you dig deeper, there's some really interesting patterns. For example, the gender divide. If we look at the data down gender-identified lines, and sorry, Gallup, like many pollsters, still splits stuff out in terms of binary gender, male-identified and female-identified persons were fairly evenly split when it came to EV ownership, with 6% of male and 7% of female-identified people saying they already owned an EV. But if we look at the number who said they were seriously considering buying an EV, there is a noticeable gender split, with 6% of male-identified respondents and 11% of female-identified respondents saying they were seriously considering buying an EV. Respondents who said they might consider buying an EV in the future were evenly split at 35%, while those who said they would not buy an electric vehicle were split with a 51 to 45% split between male and female identified people, respectively. Why is this so important? Well, historically, women buy more cars than men. At least 60% of all cars are currently purchased by women. That's from data according to multiple different studies. And studies also show that women tend to take longer to make a purchase decision on average than men. Women also tend to buy more new cars than men. What I just said was either something you already knew or it's a total surprise to you, but it always makes me laugh because vehicles have always, traditionally at least, been marketed towards men rather than women. But if women are making more of the purchase decisions, it kind of highlights the way that the auto industry has been doing this thing all wrong. And it also showcases how the now infamous Cadillac ELR ad of a decade ago failed so hard. N'est-ce pas? Aside from the gender split in respondents, another important one to note is the divide based on income. Looking at annual household income, it's no surprise that attitudes towards EVs changed based on how much money someone earns a year. Homes with incomes above $100,000 a year were the most likely to either already own an EV, 14% of respondents in that income group, or be seriously considering an EV, 11%. Of all of the income groups, they also had the lowest percentage of people who said they would not buy an EV, 41%. Meanwhile, at the other end of the spectrum was the lowest income group surveyed, people whose income was less than $40,000 per year. Only 2% of those respondents said they owned an EV, 7% said they were seriously considering it, and a massive 61% said they wouldn't be buying an EV. And that reinforces something we've been saying for a really, really long time. EVs are still too darned expensive. And while I can already hear the pitter-patter of keyboard warriors telling me in all caps and random caps that Tesla is more than affordable and that nobody has an excuse, or making comments from those that fancy themselves as mouthpieces for long debunked bovine byproduct pertaining to racial stereotypes in education and income level, so before they start typing, know this. In today's financial climate, in order to own a brand new EV, and assuming you have good credit, no down payment, and you're eligible for all current incentives, you still need to be earning somewhere in the region of $35,000 to $45,000 a year at a minimum. And that likely would also require your housing payments to be tiny, or in fact, zero. And at that income level, it's likely that there are two groups of people: retired homeowners and those who are neither retired nor homeowners. The second of those will be paying through the nose for rent, which has increased in cost far faster than pay packets have. In the last 3 years alone, rent has increased an average of 2.61% year over year. This is 169% faster than the real average wage as defined by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. Given that situation, it is no surprise that more people said that they would not be buying an EV. And really super interesting out of this is the fact that the group grew by 18 percentage points from last year's survey. It frankly reinforces that while the US economy is bouncing back and unemployment remains low, the massive divide between the haves and have-nots is only getting larger. I would love to see some more comprehensive surveys that offer lower income households the option to buy an EV at a price they could actually afford, and then see if they were interested, because I suspect the data from those surveys might be very, very different. It also reinforces how we need more education around EVs, because there are used EVs available that can be purchased for far less than the numbers I just gave you. Next, let's hone in on age. As you might expect, younger people are more likely to consider EVs or already own EVs, with 10% of the youngest group, 18 to 29-year-olds, saying they currently own an EV. Although it's also worth noting that only 10% responded that they were seriously considering buying an EV, but of all the age groups were most likely, 42%, to consider buying an EV at some point in the future. This again speaks to our dire need in the industry for automakers to stop spending massive sums of money making cars for the upper middle and upper class and instead start making EVs that everyone can afford. That said, I've also looked into ownership in different countries around the world, and attitudes towards EVs aren't just based on family income, but also the state of incentives, the price ranges of available EVs, and attitudes towards public charging. In the US, for example, EVs are often, although not always, portrayed as vehicles that only urbanites and suburbanites drive, while in much of Europe it is far more likely that an EV owner will live outside of a large city and commute in because distances are shorter, urban sprawl is less of a thing, and much more densely populated city centres tend to be less welcoming of car ownership of any sort. That means more EV owners are in rural areas. That and petrol is substantially more expensive, adding to the economic benefits of owning an EV. And yes, there are some studies out there that suggest the more money you have in certain places, like London for example, the less likely it is you'll own an EV because you can afford to pay the tens of thousands of pounds a year combined for congestion charging and for filling up your V8 because you got loads of money. Back to this Gallup poll. It's also no surprise that those who are aged between 30 and 49 are the largest group of EV and seriously considering EV across the entire survey, with a similar number of people owning EVs and the next segment, the 50 to 64-year-old group, but fewer people in that group seriously considering buying an EV. Again, this comes back to the whole affordability thing. It makes sense if you are heading towards retirement that you are less likely to want to spend huge sums of money on the latest and greatest EV if that money is either coming out of your savings account or would require you to take out a multi-year finance deal. You might have more disposable income in that period of your life between the ages of 50 and 65 than you did when you were younger, but plenty of people I know who are that age are turning their attention to maximising their retirement savings, having seen what's happened to the corporate pension funds and state retirement eligibility of their parents' generations. Yes, there are outliers, of course, but if we want EVs to be truly adopted, this shows more work needs to be done. In a related question to the age question, those who are most worried about the environment and global warming are also those who are more likely to want to make the switch to or already have made the switch to an EV. Traditionally, though, plenty of other surveys back this up, the youngest generations are the ones who worry the most about anthropogenic climate change. I mean, let's face it, if you're old enough to know why you carried a pencil with your Walkman, or indeed remember what a Walkman is, you're really not going to feel the full brunt of anthropogenic climate change, are you? They're the ones who are also least likely to be able to afford an EV. Up to this point, I've skillfully avoided the matter of FUD, but don't worry, because I'm getting to it right now. Specifically, the matter of political affiliation. Of those questioned, remember, while this survey was only just over 1,000 people, Gallup is confident it can scale it up to account for a larger part of the US population. We're going to look at political parties and ideology. And despite some evidence in recent years suggesting that more conservative and right-leaning people were considering an EV than in previous years, especially for those who identify as fiscally conservative but socially liberal, and yes, they exist, they're the ones that the MAGA party tends to call rhinos, there's a very clear delineation between political affiliation and EV ownership. Just 4% of those who identified as conservative and 11% of those who identified as liberal said they were current EV owners, with 3% and 16% respectively saying they were seriously considering buying an EV. A full 72% of those who identified as conservative said that they would not buy an EV, while just 1/4 of those who identified as liberal said they'd not buy an EV. For political party affiliation, there was a similar pattern, with 6% of registered Republicans saying they owned an EV, 2% saying that they were seriously considering an EV, and 69% saying that they would not buy an EV. Compare that to the independent respondents who sat somewhere in the middle, and to Democrats, of whom 9% said they owned an EV, 15% said they were considering it, and just 27% said they wouldn't buy an EV, and you see a pattern. At this point, I'm sure people will argue that all of this has nothing to do with political party affiliation or ideology, but sadly it does. While I will admit there are some self-selecting factors here, you're more likely, although by no means a certainty, to lean more conservative and be more likely to vote Republican if you live in a rural part of the US, and conversely, you're more likely, although again, by no means a certainty, to be more liberal-leaning and Democrat voting if you live in a city. It's well known that political party does have a massive impact on someone's views of EVs. And of course, political party affiliation and ideology can be pretty closely linked to your level of education, with those educated to a higher level skewing towards more liberal and Democrat voting tendencies, although again, most certainly not a certainty. And there are also some parts of the US where that is less true, like large parts of Utah, for example, but Utah is due in part to the prominence of the LDS Church in the state, and that is well outside of my purview for this particular video. The political divide right now in the US is a massive chasm, and while some people might argue that people like Elon Musk have bridged the gap to encourage more right-leaning folks to switch to EVs, the majority of right-leaning news outlets and politicians don't like them. You only have to watch the massive number of news stories from outlets like Fox News, one of which Kate expertly debunked on this channel in detail, to see that the media most consumed by folks who lean conservative and Republican is most likely to be bashing EVs rather than promoting them. And because of the current presidential campaign, that is amplified a whole lot more. On one side, there's President Biden, a pro-union candidate who has tried to push for domestic EV production using the sticks and carrots of governmental incentives. He oversaw a massive deployment of funding for EV charging infrastructure through the Infrastructure Act, and while the White House's policies aren't the greenest, the US is currently producing far more fossil fuel than at any point in its history, EVs are being promoted as a necessary transportation transition that everyone ultimately needs to make. On the other hand, former President Trump, a candidate who regularly makes his stump speeches focus on how terrible he thinks electric cars are, how EVs will end all domestic auto industry production, and how they will cause a, quote, bloodbath to be unleashed if everybody is asked to drive them, is definitely not an EV fan. That political rhetoric, amplified time and time again across the current Republican elected officials in both houses, not to mention state governors and legislators, is a common clarion call on cable news networks and talk radio shows that tend to be frequented more by those who identify as Republican and or conservative. And again, while not a foregone conclusion, Republican voters skew older than either Democrat or independent voters. And again, there's a bunch of data to back this up. A 2020 Pew Research study discovered that 70% of people who self-identify as Republican get their news exclusively from Fox News, effectively a right-leaning news bubble, while those who lean Democrat tend to get their news from a wider variety of sources, although they are also, in their own way, a left-leaning news bubble. And multiple studies over the last 20 years, including from Gallup, shows that those who tend towards conservative and Republican talking points are twice as likely to listen to talk radio when considered to those who lean liberal and Democrat. And as we have proven time and time again, Fox News and more recently networks like OAN, along with talk radio shows and podcasts, are far more likely to broadcast anti-EV sentiment. So we are seeing a downward trend split down what feels like socio-economic, political and age lines. But why is it getting worse? Well, it's down to some big points. First, we're entering into an election cycle which is super, mega, hyper partisan. In order to portray the other guy, whichever side that happens to be, as the baddie, political parties are leaning into everything that makes that person appear bad. EVs are in that list for those who want to see a second Trump term, along with immigrants, vaccines, masks, and the entire LGBTQIA+ community. I mean, just think, if the various legislatures of the US states had applied as much legislative time and energy to fixing climate change and making affordable EVs, renewable energy, and decent public charging a reality as they had to legislating where I can pee, what my ID says, or what rights a pregnant person has, I could stop this channel tomorrow because we'd all be driving EVs by now. And I would really like to stop this channel. Because we're here in the election cycle, more money is being pumped into political ads and more people are engaging with political discourse and political content on social media. And that means, I'm going to wager, that the anti-EV rhetoric will rise until at least this fall's election. I'm also seeing it in other countries too, where there are elections this year, like the UK, for example. But the less I say about the UK, the better. Because I definitely do not want to visit the Casbah. So there we have it. FUD is working, at least for now, to make people less interested in EVs. But the real takeaway from this all isn't that it's worse or that EVs are bad or that we're going to see EVs fade into the background. It's that we, and by we I mean you, I, and everyone else who is eager to see a cleaner, greener, more equitable transportation landscape, need to up our game. We need to increase our advocacy, we need to increase our education efforts, and we need to be willing to have conversations about EV ownership. We need to step up and educate others, help new owners, and continue to campaign for fewer six-figure EVs and more EVs that single parents can afford, more EVs that are good for retirees, and more good for college kids. But also, importantly, we need to get active and work towards a future where EVs are a smaller part of the solution. Because frankly, it's more about good public transit and good housing and walkable cities than it ever has been about another $80,000 sports sedan that's pretending to be an SUV. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Thanks for joining me today, and if you've got thoughts, make sure you leave them below in our Discord chat room, or you can reach out to us on Mastodon. Thanks to the amazing list of people scrolling by on your screen right now. They are some of the more than 1,500 people that help make this channel possible by funding it through Patreon and YouTube, covering our bills, paying our team, and making sure we can be 100% independent. If you'd like to join them and see your name listed here, just follow the links below. There are a range of different tiers you can sign up for, from as little as $1 a month, or if you pay yearly, $10.08 a year. A massive welcome to our newest supporters, Ralph Koenig, Mr. Eldritch, Dwayne Adiger, and Corey Singletray. To join our list and get your shout out, become a paid Patreon member for your week of fame. If you'd like to support us with a one-off donation, you'll also find links below to make Ko-fi and Bitcoin donations, and we even have an old-fashioned PO box you can reach us at. The address is listed below. And of course, if you're in need of some swag, you'll find our swag store link in the down below as well. This month, we are celebrating Wrangling EV FUD with a fantastic t-shirt design by our in-house artist and animator, Erin. Get yours today by heading to our Redbubble store. We've got some great content coming up, so make sure you're subscribed on PeerTube or YouTube, and we'll see you soon. We make new videos every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. If you want more, the mighty algorithm thinks you'll like this video, but we also think that this one is well worth a look. See you soon, and as always, keep evolving.